Wealthier nations are blocking a desperate push by developing countries to waive patent rights for vaccines. This comes after South Africa and India renewed efforts recently to reduce the enforcement of an intellectual property protection agreement put in place by the World Trade Organization. They argue it will allow generic vaccine production to close the disparities in poor countries, but some major Western powers are opposing the move. In an interview with CBS News, the executive director for the joint UN program on HIV/AIDS recalled a similar situation.
It took people living with HIV to mobilize around the world to protest and eventually for the prices to come down from $10,000 per person per year down to $100 per person per year overnight. We don't need to do this again. We must not watch people dying when the vaccines are being rolled out in richer countries.
So that interview was conducted by Debora Patta. Debora is a CBS News foreign correspondent, and she joins us now from Johannesburg. So Debora, the executive director in that clip was referring, of course, to the issue of patent waivers. What are the arguments for and against patent waivers in this case, and is there precedence for this?
Indeed, a very articulate argument there from Winnie Byanyima, who heads up the HIV/AIDS program of the United Nations. The argument for, simply put, is that people are dying and there's a desperate vaccine shortage. And South Africa and India have tabled a proposal asking the World Trade Organization to waive patent rights on all COVID vaccines. The argument against, usually from wealthier countries, is that this will hamper science and investment, and that there are enough rules that are flexible enough to allow for the manufacture of vaccines in other countries. The counter argument is that that's going to take far too much time. Is there precedent? Absolutely. As you heard right there in that clip that you played, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, it took the world 6 years before it realized that it had a global responsibility to ensure that everyone, rich and poor, received access to life-saving drugs. You had a situation where over that period of time, 9 million people at the very least died globally because they did not have access to these drugs because they were too expensive. $10,000 as opposed to eventually $100, as you heard there in the clip. In South Africa alone, 2 million people died from HIV/AIDS pandemic. It remains a twin killer together with TB in this country. And there was a 3-year fight to get the price of drugs reduced through patent waivers so that they could be easily available to all. Now, very interestingly, at that time, the United States was in front of the campaign to ensure that countries around the world received access to life-saving drugs under a program known as PEPFAR, initiated by former President George W. Bush. This went to 50 countries, and it's estimated that 18 million lives were saved as a result of this. And now they're calling for something similar with the COVID vaccine. Anne-Marie?
So then what is the situation currently regarding vaccine inequality between sort of developed nations and developing nations?
It's not a pretty picture at all, Anne-Marie. You have a situation where wealthy nations have snapped up the lion's share of doses. Even though they only represent 14% of the world's population, they can vaccinate in some countries their population many times over. We've heard President Joe Biden say that he hopes that everyone who wishes to have access, every eligible adult, will have access to a vaccine by May. In many developing countries, 9 out of 10 people won't be vaccinated this year at all. You've seen countries, I think over 100, who haven't received a single dose yet. Here in South Africa, which has one of the more robust health systems on this continent, only over 120,000 health workers have been vaccinated so far. There are simply not enough doses to go around. And you have a situation where if you add up the collective excess of global vaccines that wealthier nations have accumulated, that is vaccines that they don't need, it amounts to over 1 billion doses, and that's almost enough to vaccinate the entire African continent. Anne-Marie?
Wow. So then where do things stand with the so-called TRIPS decision? And how does it affect the rest of the world if developing countries are not vaccinated at the same time?
That's a very, very important question. The decision ultimately will be referred to the World Trade Organization. The head of the WTO has said that clearly something needs to be done. She talks of being able to walk while chewing gum, that the discussions should go on, but at the same time urging countries to waive the rules and allow other countries to manufacture the vaccine. But as you heard when Ian Lee was talking, that essentially what you have is a situation where nobody is safe until everyone is safe. The virus is mutating. We've seen it here in South Africa. We've seen it in Brazil. And as long as there is patchy immunity, as long as poorer countries are not vaccinated at the same time as wealthy countries, the virus rages on. It is allowed to mutate. There's also a financial argument. Vaccine delays, according to the International Chamber of Commerce, will cost the world $9 trillion. Half of that cost will be borne by wealthy nations. And I'm reminded of a very lovely story from the 50s. Jonas Salk, an American virologist who was instrumental in the first successful polio vaccine, was asked, who owns the patent? And his response was, the people, I assume. There is no patent. Can you patent the sun? Anne-Marie?
Indeed, it is a global problem. It is going to take a global solution, global cooperation. Debora, thank you very much.